ceiling that's coming up very soon, and also with the efforts currently to abolish the Fed now that Ron Paul is in his position of oversight. How is there a scenario where the markets actually could have a significant negative impact on the dollar in the near term that is a shock that creates real repercussions?
Yeah, I do think that foreigners are looking intently for evidence that the United States is able to get its fiscal house in order. If the two things you describe occurred simultaneously, where there were where the federal government couldn't pay its bills, and there were serious questions about whether the Fed would retain its tactical independence, I think those two things combined could lead to the kind of scenario I described, where foreigners decided they wanted to drastically reduce the share of their portfolios held in dollars. Again, I'll repeat the good news that I described before, which is it's not entirely clear where they can move at the moment. You know, the fact that European problems are now coming to a head, and China hasn't gone very far down this road, means that when the Russian central bank wanted to diversify out of dollars last year, they bought Canadian dollars. And there simply aren't that many tradable assets, you know, not a big country to go around. The Canadians and the Australians and the others who are seeing their currencies being purchased and their exchange rates going through the roof are not entirely happy about the prospect either. But I do very much worry about the scenario you describe, but investors have to have somewhere to flee to.
You mentioned the difficulties of divided government, you know, when it comes to devising things and doing things that need to be done. I'm just curious, is there a historical record? Did the country do better in periods of divided government or when it was completely dominated by one or the other party, or is there any correlation?
So that's a very good question for a better political scientist than I am. I simply don't know the answer to that. I think, you know, in the case of the United States, the kind of fiscal problems we have are not going to be solved by one dominant party cramming down a solution on the other. We're going to have, you know, have that national dialogue everybody now talks about, and craft a political compromise that involves both parties if we're going to solve this. But you have to be a much better political scientist than I am to imagine how that might happen.
Is there any straightforward way for anyone in this room to invest in currency volatility? And if so, are you a buyer or a seller?
Well, truth be known, my wife manages our portfolio. There's also the statement economists like that if anything involves the second derivative, not the change, the direction of the currency, but the volatility, or even worse, the third derivative, the skewness, that argument is too complicated to be believable. So, I guess we're still in very fragile times in the sense that many things can go wrong with global recovery now underway. We have problems in the United States. They have problems in Europe. China could conceivably have financial problems associated with the now sudden tightening up of bank lending. So I can imagine a bunch of scenarios in which volatility spikes. But as I said before, if you want to think the way I try to think in this book about how the world will look in 10 years, I guess I would be a seller of volatility in that setting rather than a buyer. But investment advice about what to do in 10 years is not helpful investment advice. I apologize.
Hi. In your basket of currencies, the three or the five strongest currencies are net buyers of gold. How do you put gold into this monetary pot?
Gold has been an important international form of international reserves and unit of account for, or it was for half a century and more after 1870, until very recently, central banks had been sellers of gold. So as a result of this historical tradition and legacy, they had inherited a lot of gold, and they had been selling it in order to invest in other units, other assets that bore interest. In the last year or two, as the world has become a very risky place, that has basically stopped, and a few central banks, the Reserve Bank of India, for example, have purchased modest amounts of gold. John Maynard Keynes, the famous British economist responsible for, in a sense, for the creation of the International Monetary Fund, said already in the 1920s that gold is a barbarous relic inherited from the past. And if you want to hedge against risk, there are probably other more efficient ways of doing it. We have inflation index treasuries that, except in this scenario where you worry about default on those instruments, are a more efficient way of hedging against inflation. So the problem with the gold market is that it's small and it's very volatile, and at the moment it's very high. So I've just given you three problems with the gold market. The way I sometimes put this, now that we've moved into the realm of investment advice, I want to be really brutally honest here. I have been predicting weaker gold prices for 10 years now, and I will and I will keep predicting them until I'm right.
Could we go back to the issue of China selling its U.S. Treasury securities? You and others have articulated a lot of reasons why it's not in their interest, economic interest, to do that. What possible scenarios do you see that would actually cause them to sell 10 or 20% of their securities?
Well, so the question is, China is reluctant to sell its dollars because as a financial maneuver, it might be shooting itself in its own foot, that it would be driven by, it's such a big player in the market for U.S. Treasuries that selling a portion of what it holds would depress the prices of what remained. The scenario in which China would say that's an acceptable price to pay is, of course, one where there is some kind of geopolitical dispute between China and the United States over Taiwan, over North Korea, over Iran, over oil supplies from Central Asia, who knows what. So there is a famous episode along these lines when Britain and France invaded Suez in order to secure the canal against Nasser's nationalization. Suez was the key point of transit for oil from the Middle East to Western Europe before the age of supertankers. Now they can't fit through the canal anymore, but back then it was a big deal, and the French and British dropped paratroopers, collaborated with the Israelis in seizing the canal in 1956. Eisenhower didn't like it. The U.S. didn't like it, and Britain had financial problems. We hinted about selling our holdings of British Treasury securities, and we said we're not going to let the UK borrow from the International Monetary Fund if it gets into trouble, unless you withdraw your troops from Suez. And in the end, that's exactly what they had to do. They had to crawl down. So that situation is different from ours with China. The U.S. was an immensely larger economy. Our holdings of British treasuries were small, so we weren't going to do big damage to ourselves financially if we sold them at a low price. China is there isn't that kind of imbalance between the U.S. and China. But my answer to you would be one can imagine a geopolitical dispute being the trigger for this kind of Chinese-induced dollar crash. I talked at length about our doing it to ourselves. To my mind, that is the bigger risk. But a previous question was about the changing of the guard, and China is now coming geopolitically. The news last week and this is about missiles that have much greater range to knock out destroyers, about China for the first time in 600 years becoming a naval power, at which point it can really challenge the United States in the Pacific. So this is something to think about and worry about.
We're going to take one more question. But before we take that question, you can all help the currency markets by buying a copy of his book over there. And right after this last question, he'll be happy to sign copies. So one last question.
Thank you for your time. With currency as a technology, and the argument that that being an outdated technology, that we have science and technology to get raw materials to everyone on the planet, and currency being a technology that perpetuates politics and poverty and war, what is your answer or argument to, or answer to groups that purport a resource-based economy and moving away from a currency system altogether?
So I'm not entirely sure what you mean by a resource-based economy. Go ahead.
That all the resources on the planet for food, education, healthcare, that they're the natural right of for all the people of the planet.
So my answer to that would be that as someone who identifies with European social democracy, for example, I think justice and income distribution and adequate health care and nutrition for all are critically important. But I think the monetary system can be enlisted in delivering them. I think one thing that we have learned from centuries of history is that the price mechanism is important for getting things produced and getting them to the people who, for whom they have the most value. And currency or money is an important part of that price mechanism. So if I understand where you're coming from, I don't think there is incompatibility between what you're after, which is that economic growth is critically important. Lifting people out of poverty is what economics is all about. There's no incompatibility between that and the idea that a price system, a market mechanism, and a monetary system that is grease for the wheels of that market mechanism can all work together.
Thank you very much, Professor.